Now we want to create a DbContext. So first I'm going to go into terminal, create a new folder called persistence. Okay, here it is. Now inside this folder, I'm going to add a new C# class and call it Vega DbContext. So similar to Entity Framework 6, we want to derive this class from DbContext. And now we need to import the namespace. So it's defined in Microsoft.Entity Framework Core. Now in Entity Framework 6, we also used to add a constructor here. So Vega DbContext. This constructor would take a connection string or connection string name. So connection string. And then we would pass it to the base class, DbContext. Now DbContext would use system.configuration.configuration-manager class to look into web.config under connection strings element. Then it will look for a connection string with this name here. And if it didn't find a connection string with that name, it would assume this string itself is the connection string. Now, as you can see from this red underline here, this model is changed in Entity Framework Core. So Entity Framework Core is designed in a more loosely coupled fashion. So it's decoupled from this configuration manager class. Instead, we need to explicitly pass the connection string to it. So let me show you how this works. Now, instead of using a string as the connection string here, we use DbContext options. This is a new class. And this class is generic. The generic parameter is the type of our context. In this case, Vega DbContext. So we call this options. And then we pass it to our base class, DbContext. Okay? So the error is gone. Now we need to register this DbContext as a service for dependency injection. So later, when we create a controller, we're going to pass this DbContext in the constructor of our controller. And the dependency injection framework inside ASP.NET Core would automatically create an instance of our DbContext and pass it to our controller. So we're not going to explicitly new up a DbContext here. And that's for loose coupling, because we want to pass the dependencies of a class to its constructor. So later, when we want to unit test them, we can replace those dependencies with fake objects. It's exactly the same reason we use dependency injection in Angular. Now we need to configure this DbContext as a service for dependency injection. So let's go to the startup class. Here we have this method, configure services, and that's where we register our dependencies. So I'm going to call services, which is an iService collection or the container for all the dependencies in our application. Here we have a method, add DbContext. This method is generic, and the type of generic parameter is the type of our context. So Vega DbContext. Now let's resolve the namespace. Okay. Now here we're going to use a Lambda expression or an action that determines what persistent store we're going to use, like SQL Server, SQLite, or whatever, and what the connection string is. So we pass a parameter, options goes to options.use SQL Server. Now, this is an extension method that we need to explicitly import into this file. So on top of the file, using Microsoft.Entity Framework Core. Now, as the argument to this method, we specify our connection string. Now, of course, we don't want to hardcode the connection string here. We want to store it in our configuration file. And that's what I'm going to show you in the next lecture.